Welcome, everyone, to the 5th episode of the PlainGains podcast. I hope you're enjoying your morning thus far. Today, it's going to be a solo short episode with just me, and I'm going to be reviewing a recent study that came out a couple of months ago, potentially even this month. So the title of this study is Accuracy of Predicted Intraset Repetitions in Reserve in Single and Multi-Joint Resistant Exercises Among Trained and Untrained Men and Women. I'm going to post the link to the study below. It's not open access, so unfortunately, if you're not in a university, you won't be able to get it. But if you would like to have it, you can email me, and also you could just look at it as I'm going to share my screen on the YouTube video. You will be able to read the abstract though, so don't worry about that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for those of you watching on YouTube, and we're going to get started with what we can talk about in regards to this study. Okay, so you all should be able to see my screen now if you're watching on YouTube. I have highlighted some things in the abstract just so I don't forget. But first, in order to kind of go over the study a little bit, I'm going to give a brief summary of what happened. So basically, these researchers wanted to investigate whether we are good at estimating our RIR in a couple of different populations. So that would be men, women, trained individuals, and less trained individuals, and people that do or do not have experience training with RIR. You can find all the specifics about it in the study. If you do email me, I can send you the study to get the specifics. But pretty much what they found was that there was no significant difference between experience rating RIR and how good you actually are at rating RIR. And this was irrespective of your sex. So males and females both did not do better when having experience with RIR. But they did find that people are better at estimating their RIR when you're closer to failure, which is kind of what we expected. So mainly, I kind of wanted to just go over some limitations of the types of conclusions that we can make here and point out a couple of things that are pretty thought-provoking. So first, this is an acute study. So what that basically means is they had individuals come in on one individual day and basically do this entire protocol of things. So they tested their 5 rep max. They used an equation to calculate their 1 rep max. They took 72.5% of their 1 rep max and performed that until failure on 3 different exercises. They were bicep curls, tricep pushdowns, and seated cable rows. And the participants were asked to say when they thought they were at 5 RIR, and then every single subsequent repetition, they were supposed to estimate their RIR. So, for example, if they were on rep 10 and they thought that was 5 RIR, they would say 5 RIR, and they would continue to do so until they reached momentary muscular failure. So basically, they could not complete another rep with the same designated technique. These individuals also had verbal encouragement from the researchers. So that basically means like your gym friend being like, oh, one more, come on, you got it, let's go, all that type of stuff. And so make sure you keep that in mind, as that's going to be a little bit important when we're talking about the conclusions that we can draw from this study. So again, to summarize, 72.5% of their 1 rep max, beginning your RIR callouts at RIR 5, and 72.5% of 1 rep max falls in roughly the 12 to 20 rep range. So that's the rep range they're working with in this study. Okay, so that pretty much covers the methods. And for those of you kind of wondering how you should look at different studies, I think one really good approach of critically reviewing literature is to first read the abstract, see what's going on in the study, and then investigate the methods and then the discussion section. Because while you could flip the order around, you could read discussion and then methods, depending on what their conclusions are. For example, if in the abstracts there's not strong conclusions that you would potentially disagree with, it may be worth it to just skip to the discussion, see if there's anything that's like, maybe I should look into that further. And then if there is, you can go check the methods section. Additionally, a lot of times people just cite things. And so if they cite something and you're like, I don't know if that's right or that doesn't make sense, you can actually just go click the citation and read the paper, or at least the discussion of that paper, because a lot of times people will claim things were said in a paper and that is not exactly what was said at all. I'm not saying this happened in this paper. It's just something to be aware of when you're critically reviewing other papers in general. Okay, so if you're looking at the screen, you can see some of the methods here. That's pretty much what I just talked about. Again, these were university-age students, so that's the population they're working with. So it's not necessarily true that this is going to apply to older populations, but I don't see a reason why it wouldn't. Okay, so one thing I wanted to point out here was that the RIR experience in their questionnaire, so how they determine people's training ages and whether they had training experience utilizing repetitions in reserve, is they basically just used a questionnaire, and so they had to get IRB or International Review Board approval for this questionnaire, which is standard practice. And basically, the question was like, have you ever trained using RIR before? So that's basically a yes or no question. And so that's a pretty vague question. And I'm going to point out kind of one thing that is interesting to think about when you're answering a vague question like that, is that it doesn't really tell you how skilled a person thinks they are or how skilled they actually are at a particular task. For example, it's the same type of question as asking someone if they play basketball or if they've played basketball. Like, what if they played basketball once a week for 3 years in middle school? The answer to that question would still be yes. Now, it's obviously going to be a little bit different here. Like, the people that have trained with RIR probably have done it more recently, especially given that the maximum training age was only roughly 5 years. Or actually, that was the average for the men. But regardless, it's a little bit different, but it's a similar type of vibe. So you can kind of get what I'm saying here is that even if you have experience with RIR, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're good at tracking your RIR. And so that's something that kind of limits the conclusions here, because you'll see a lot of people that utilize RIR that have never actually gone to failure before with verbal encouragement. So if you walk into a university gym, nowadays you're going to see all these science-based kids doing sets to, quote, 2 RIR, but in reality, it's a set of Smith machine squats, and they have 0 concentric velocity slowdown, and it's more like 10 RIR. And so these people would say that they are training to 2 RIR, even though that's just not accurate. And now the RIR differences that they found in this study on average were a lot smaller than that difference, but that was just an exaggeration to kind of illustrate my point with why you can't necessarily use that binary question as evidence to claim that training experience with RIR does not make you better at training with RIR. Okay, so moving down the line, I mentioned in the beginning of this that it is an acute study. So what that basically means, like I said, is that people come in and it's like a one-time event. So the study was not investigating whether individuals that now begin to start training with RIR and continue to train with RIR get better at estimating their RIR over time. So a way to do that would be to take maybe untrained individuals and have them try and estimate their repetitions in reserve on the first day, and then have them train each week on some training program, and they come in like every 4 weeks or twice or whatever, and you see if they got better at tracking their RIR over time, and you would be able to see a difference and see if there was a statistically significant difference in their starting RIR estimation difference and their ending RIR estimation difference in their middle one, for example. That's just one way that you could set the study up, but that is not what the study was doing. It was kind of looking at a single time event with a bunch of different people that have varying different amounts of experience, whether that's with RIR or training or whatever that may be. So that definitely limits the conclusions, because it's kind of like taking two different people. Like if you take Mike Israetel, who has been training with RIR for years and years and years and is trains to failure often and knows what it feels like and knows how to train hard, and you take some random university student who just started tracking RIR, or maybe they've been doing it for a while but they don't train to failure and they don't have verbal encouragement, Mike Israetel is going to be significantly better at guesstimating his RIR in comparison to the university student, despite them both having experience utilizing RIR in their training. Additionally, the insignificant difference found with people that are more trained, so people that have trained for a longer period of time, again has similar limitations, because the amount of years or months that you've been training does not necessarily correlate to how good you are at training. You could take someone that's been training for 1 year, but has been trained by some professional like Mike Israetel, Eric Helms, whatever, for the entire duration of their training career. They're probably going to be a lot better at estimating RIR than someone who's never been coached before, never gone to failure before, but's been training in the gym for 5 years. So I think it is a skill that you have to acquire, and that individuals who use RIR after training to failure very often and understanding what that feels like, and having a more experienced individual take you to complete failure with verbal encouragement, you're going to build that skill over time, especially if you train to failure frequently. So moving on to the second limitation that I wanted to talk about, or maybe it wasn't the second, is the rep range 12 to 20. So that's kind of a higher rep range. And in these higher rep ranges, a lot of times the burning sensation starts to come into play and can kind of alter your perception of RIR. Now, the exercises they chose, this is not going to be as significant of an issue as it would be with something perhaps like a leg extension, but it's definitely still something to consider, as people will probably underestimate their RIR more in higher rep ranges because the burn hurts a lot more, and so they want to stop earlier. I know for myself, I do the same thing. If I'm taking a set of leg extensions of 20 reps close to failure, I'm going to want to stop way before failure, meaning I can't actually move my legs. So that's why I like to keep leg extensions, particularly in a lower rep range. So that's definitely one limitation here, is I would like to see this repeated with lower rep ranges, where maybe like a 5 to 10 or something like that, where the burning sensation doesn't induce as much of a desire to volitionally fail. Okay, so moving on to kind of the conclusions that they made. Let me read some of the stuff here. RIR was predicted closer to failure and during the later sets. Okay. And interestingly, yeah, we talked about that. Okay, so on the conclusions that kind of make more sense, we have interset or intra-set prediction accuracy increased after each set. So that basically means after you performed one set and you guesstimated your RIRs, your next set was going to be slightly better, and your next set was going to be slightly better, and so on and so forth. And so that's kind of expected because, one, you're getting used to the exercise, you're getting used to what it feels like to go to failure on that exercise in that particular session. Because yes, going to failure on the same exercise on different sessions can feel different, which is shocking to some people, especially people who don't really train to failure. And so that kind of makes sense, as well as getting better at estimating your RIR when you're closer to failure. That also makes sense, because when you're at 1 RIR, you know your next rep is toast. Like, you're going to be destroyed. And if you're at 0 RIR, you know you're not getting another rep in most cases. If you're using controlled technique, not bouncing, blah, 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 you get the gist of it. One interesting point that they do note here is that individuals who tend to be more accurate with their initial prediction remained more accurate when predicting RIR closer to failure. This makes sense, and it kind of goes along with what I was talking about with looking at somebody like Mike Israetel. If he was trying to guesstimate 4 or 5 RIR, he's probably going to be pretty accurate with it. And because he's pretty accurate with that 4 or 5 RIR, he's going to be accurate with the 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 RIR that comes subsequently, just because he has so much experience with it. And I think those individuals who tended to be more accurate in their initial predictions are probably people who train to failure more often and have more experience with those particular exercises that were utilized in this study, and just training with them in general. Because if you put somebody in a completely novel exercise, or one that they haven't done in a long time, their RIR prediction is probably going to be worse, just because they don't know or they don't remember what the sensation felt like to go close to failure on. Okay, so they did point out some limitations here. Limitations different than the ones I'm pointing out here, so I'm just going to point them out really quickly. They said the primary limitation was that people predicted their RIR at 5, and then that can potentially skew their predictions of 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And also this study was limited to 3 different exercises: bicep curls, tricep pushdowns, and seated cable rows. That makes sense. So you can't necessarily extrapolate this data to barbell squats or bench press or whatever it may be. And they also took their RIR difference as an absolute value. So that means if you over or undershot your RIR by 1, that would technically produce the same exact difference, which would be used the same way in the statistical analysis. And now I don't really think this is a huge problem, because I would assume a majority of the individuals were undershooting their RIR, as that's what's most common in the gym. But of course, it's possible that this did skew the results a little bit, because in theory, some people could be overestimating their RIR, though I think that's a little bit less likely. Okay, so to kind of wrap up everything here and to give some takeaways, basically, this study tells us that we get better at RIR tracking when we are closer to failure. It might be more challenging to track your RIR properly when you are utilizing higher rep ranges and being further away from failure, and that we can't necessarily conclude that training age and RIR experience makes you better or worse at guesstimating your RIR. I will say again, though, that if you have gone to failure with verbal encouragement multiple times and you train to failure frequently and utilize RIR and you're training daily while taking multiple sets to failure every so often, you're probably going to be better at tracking your RIR than someone who doesn't train to failure at all or barely trains to failure and still tracks their RIR. So that's definitely one thing to consider. And finally, I would say if you're looking for things that you can apply to your own training, this kind of reinforces the fact that training closer to failure is probably going to be easier to track, because we are better at estimating our RIR when we are closer to failure. And it also might be a good idea to incorporate failure training more often, just so you can remind yourself what it feels like to go to failure on these different exercises. Because again, different exercises going to failure feels completely different. As I'm sure you can imagine, leg press to failure is a lot more challenging and feels a lot different than doing forearm wrist curls to failure. So I hope you enjoyed this short podcast solo episode with me. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on the YouTube channel and leave us a rating on the Spotify. And if you wanted to see more study reviews, or if you want to learn how to read a research paper, you can send me an email or message me on Instagram, or comment below if you would like me to review any particular paper. You can just drop me the DOI and I'll take a look at it. Thanks again for listening. See you guys next week. Adios.